Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 788 for October 13th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
This was kind of our contribution to the Redbreast fan that's based in America that doesn't have ready access to those single cask Redbreast that other markets are lucky to have.
This has been a busy week for the Irish Distillers blending team of Billy Leighton and David McCabe. They've been in the U.S. unveiling a new series of Redbreast small batch editions for selected retailers in Massachusetts and California. It's the first time Irish Distillers has released a Redbreast small batch edition outside of Ireland, and the announcement comes just days after the release of the 2019 edition of Middleton Very Rare. I caught up with Billy and Dave the other night in Boston, and you'll hear our conversation in just a few minutes on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, Your Voice, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's start with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The controversial 25% tariff on U.S. imports of single malt whiskies from Scotland and Northern Ireland is scheduled to go into effect this coming Friday. A formal vote is expected Monday in Geneva, where the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution body is expected to rubber stamp the U.S. request to approve the so-called countermeasures. The Trump administration took a major step in that process this week with the official publication in the Federal Register of the European goods to be hit with tariffs ranging from 10 to 25%. As we reported last time around, this particular set of tariffs comes after the World Trade Organization authorized the U.S. to impose tariffs on $7.5 billion worth of European exports as a penalty for illegal subsidies to European aircraft maker Airbus in a 15-year legal fight. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson talked with President Donald Trump Wednesday night, hours after the Federal Register's publication, and urged him to scrap the tariffs. Former Scottish Secretary David Mundell warned the tariff could affect up to 3,000 jobs in Scotland and cost £228 million. And executives from 20 different Scotch whisky companies are warning that the tariffs could cut their U.S. exports by a fifth and cause, quote, irreparable damage to the industry. Those comments came in a joint letter to the editors of The Telegraph. The executives include Glenfarclas chairman John Grant and Gordon and MacPhail managing director Ewan McIntosh. We do know that diplomats from the U.S. and Europe have been discussing the tariffs and the underlying aviation dispute, especially since a similar WTO ruling against the U.S. for subsidies to Boeing is several months away. There's no telling whether a last-minute compromise could be reached that might stop the tariffs from taking effect. We'll keep you updated throughout the week. Once again, that tariff of 25% applies only to single malt whiskies exported to the U.S. from Scotland and Northern Ireland. There is still no response to the tariffs from Bushmills and its owner, New Jersey-based Proximo Spirits. Bushmills and its sister brand, The Sexton, appear to be the only Irish single malts that would be affected by the tariffs. It appears, though, that distillers in Wales and England have escaped the tariff And while Penderyn Managing Director Stephen Davies is breathing a bit easier, he is still in wait-and-see mode.
One of our MPs asked a question in the UK Parliament and mentioned Penderyn by name yesterday, and was suggesting that it might be an issue. But as far as we can tell, it doesn't apply to us at this stage. But then, that may or may not be the case in the near future. That may be revised. We just don't know. We have some whiskey on the water on its way over to the States, which will arrive just after the deadline. So we'll find out pretty quickly, I should imagine.
We have asked the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to clarify the confusion over Wales and England, and have yet to receive a response. The official tariff list describes Scotch and Irish single malt whiskies that are, quote, products of the United Kingdom. And while Penderyn's single malts are clearly products of the United Kingdom, they're also clearly neither Scotch nor Irish whiskey. There have been some suggestions on social media that perhaps U.S. officials don't realize that England and Wales do have their own single malt whiskies. I posed that question to Stephen Davies.
I suspect that might be the answer. That maybe as a category, we are clearly a lot smaller than the Scotch whisky industry and even probably the Northern Irish. So I suspect as a category, value and volume wise, we probably haven't hit the radar, perhaps. But I can only imagine that would be the case because we do fall in a category which is just labelled as other on the list. So we might have just escaped their attention. I don't know, but. The less we say about it, the better, so I probably shouldn't be even talking to you about it.
Once again, we'll have details at whiskycast.com on any developments this week as they occur. Back to Penderyn for just a minute. Last time around, we reported that the Welsh government has agreed to provide £1.4 million in funding for one of the two planned Penderyn expansion projects. The project would bring a second Penderyn distillery to North Wales in the coastal town of Llandudno.
It's a £5 million investment in total, and the Welsh Government money is part of that, and that is all confirmed, and so we are able to move forward. We still have some planning to get approved for the distillery, but we think that's going to, hopefully that will take maybe in the region of 3 months if it goes okay. And hopefully it'll go well. We've got some consultations with the local community to make sure everybody understands what we're doing and how we will fit into the local environment. So we're just commencing that phase of the project now. And the hope is, Mark, that we will be opening the doors in early 2021.
There are also plans on the drawing board for a third distillery to be built in Swansea on the site of a former copper works. Davies says that project is running about a year behind the Llandudno project. Once completed, the spirit from all three Penderyn distilleries will be matured separately. That'll allow for future single malt bottlings from each distillery and the potential for blended malts that combine whiskey from all three. In other news, let the annual rites of begging, pleading, and just plain whining begin. The Van Winkle family and Buffalo Trace are getting ready to ship the 2019 editions of the Old Rip Van Winkle and Pappy Van Winkle's Family Reserve whiskies. They're warning consumers to stay clear of black market dealers offering the highly sought-after whiskies. And they're also reminding consumers that they can't control the prices retailers actually charge. For the record, here are the official suggested retail prices for the 6 whiskies. The Old Rip Van Winkle 10-year-old bourbon, $69.99. Old Rip Van Winkle Special Reserve 12-year-old bourbon, also known as the Lot B bourbon, $79.99. Old Rip Van Winkle Family Reserve 13-year-old rye, $119.99. That's the same price for the Pappy Van Winkle's Family Reserve 15-year-old bourbon. The Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve 20-year-old bourbon, $199.99. And the Pappy Van Winkle's Family Reserve 23-year-old bourbon, $299.99. Now, if you actually manage to get a bottle of any of those at the suggested retail price, and you're not living in a control state where the government uses the suggested retail prices as gospel, let us know about it. Bruichladdich is out with Adam Hinnett's third edition of Black Art since he took over as master distiller for Jim McEwen a few years ago. Black Art is the distillery's mystery whiskey, where all we get is the age, the bottling strength, and the number of bottles available. All of the rest stays inside Adam's head. Black Art 7.1 is a 25-year-old single malt, bottled at 48.4% ABV. And the whiskeys are from 1994, which Adam reminds us was a very important year.
1994 was, of course, the year the distillery closed down. So this is kind of the last of that spirit, if you like, or some of the last of that spirit. We don't use it all, but some of the last of that spirit from 94, which, is symbolic, for us, because you think of how the distillery was being run up until then. It was it was producing whiskey for blends, and it wasn't really, it may never have come back to life. It could have been 94. That was it. We never saw Bruichladdich ever again, which would have been a travesty. So 94 is, and whiskies like that, the whiskies we have from before 94 and up to 94, they make you really think about how we enjoy amazing conditions at the distillery today, amazing opportunities, and we're able to express who we are and where we come from. We're able to employ 100 people in the company. We're able to grow barley on the island and do amazing things for the community. So whiskies like this 94, it could just be four numbers, but it means an awful lot. And people who know about Bruichladdich know that date, and they know what it means.
Only 12,000 bottles will be available. That's compared to the 18,000 bottles for Black Art 6.1. The recommended retail price, £275 a bottle in the UK. The US pricing has not been announced just yet. Meanwhile, the English Whiskey Company is releasing a new single malt that may not be subject to the US tariffs. Smoky Virgin is a peated whiskey matured in virgin oak for almost 7 years and bottled at 46% ABV. It's available through the distillery's online shop for £51.99 a bottle. That's about $66 US at current exchange rates. Chicago's Fuse Spirits has been working with rock bands to create whiskeys since 2016, when founder Paul Hletko teamed up with the Flaming Lips on Brainville rye whiskey. Now, he and the band Alice in Chains have collaborated on All Secrets Known. It's a bourbon finished in tequila barrels and bottled at 50.5% ABV, 101 proof. It's available for around $75 a bottle. This time a year ago, Dublin's Teeling Whiskey Company released its first batch of single pot still whiskey that was made at the distillery in the Liberties. There have been 2 other preview batches released since then, but now the first permanent release of Teeling single pot still whiskey is out. Master distiller Alex Chasko and his colleagues took the reaction to those 3 preview batches and used it in crafting the final version.
I think what we learned was quite simple, that people like the influence of sherry casks on single pot still, right? But they also like the influence of the American oak on there. And so it was that balance between getting the sherry earthiness and the nose, right, from the sherry cask, along with the tannins and the body coming from the American virgin oak.
The Teeling single pot still is available now in Ireland and other export markets, with the U.S. edition coming in January. I'll have more of my interview with Alex Chasko next time around. Meanwhile, the Macallan has unveiled the second release in its concept series trilogy for the travel retail market. It comes from a combination of sherry-seasoned American oak casks, Miguel Martin sherry casks, and ex-bourbon barrels. The Macallan whiskey maker Stephen Bremner created it around a concept used in music, with a bass track that's overdubbed by backing tracks that add depth and character. It's available now at the Macallan's boutique shops in Heathrow Terminal 5 and Taiwan's Taiyuan Airport in Taipei. It'll get a wider rollout starting in December. look for a price of around $150 a bottle. Also in travel retail, Beam Suntory is expanding its Legent bourbon created by Fred Noe and Suntory chief blender Shinji Fukuyo to travel retail. Legent made its debut in the U.S. market earlier this year, and it'll be available exclusively through World of Whiskies in London's Heathrow Airport and other Dufry-owned travel retail shops for the next year, with a wider global rollout after that. The Glenrothes will be releasing its 2019 Halloween edition Monday, exclusively on the distillery's website. It's a 13-year-old single malt finished in refill peated whiskey casks. Pricing will not be announced until the sale goes live on the website. Colorado's award-winning distillery 291 is releasing 2 new bourbons, batch number 23 of its High Rye bourbon and batch number 5 of Bad Guy, its wheated 4-grain bourbon. They'll be available at the distillery's tasting room in Colorado Springs and select Colorado retailers. I get a lot of emailed news releases in my inbox, but when one comes in with the subject line, "What happens when you cross a duck with a whiskey?" that one I pay attention to. Ireland's Clonakilty distillery has teamed up with Connecticut's New England Brewing Company on a special cask finish for the U.S. market. They used casks that previously held the brewery's Fuzzy Baby Ducks IPA beer to create the fuzzy cask finish. It's available now at retailers in Connecticut. No word on pricing or whether it's a quacker of a whiskey. Sorry about that. And George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon will be closing to visitors for the winter at the end of this month, except for one big event on November 9th, the inaugural George Washington Whiskey Festival. Steve Bayshore oversees the distillery and has been planning for this event for months now.
Mount Vernon's distillery over the years has really become a part of the whiskey community. And, when we started out, we're always about education, but we've become to have a lot of partners and friends in the industry and people that now come to buy our spirits on a regular basis. We thought it's time to open it all up and focus a little bit on the Washington and whiskey story, but also to just bring that crowd of Virginia distillers together, the part of heritage of Virginia, and bring the public in for an event that I think everybody will enjoy. We're also going to have traditional coopering going on there at the distillery and an 18th century baker. They're baking with flour from our grist mill. So we think it's been time for us to launch into something public. So we do a lot of private sort of events at the distillery. So I think the time had come for something like this. We will have a VIP portion at the distillery and grist mill. We're going to have distillers and experts there. We're also going to have a main event on the estate with a bunch of Virginia craft distilleries. Also, John Campbell from Lefroy will be there. Our consultant, Lisa Wicker, will be there. Dave Sherrick, Bill Thomas of Jack Rose, a number of other distillers that have helped us over the years. So we're kind of bringing a family together of people that have helped our program to let the public come in and see what we've been doing and learn about whiskey.
Tickets are still available for the festival on November 9th, and there's a link for more details in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. This is New York Rye Week, with events at distilleries around the entire state all week long, including Pastrami on Rye, Wednesday night in Brooklyn. The Red Rock Casino in Las Vegas hosts the Whiskey on the Rocks Festival this Thursday and Friday. Atlanta Magazine's annual Whiskey Festival is coming up on Thursday night. This weekend is Whiskey Live in Warsaw, Poland, along with Woodford Reserve's final Bourbon Academy Class of the Year at the distillery in Versailles, Kentucky, and the Ishikawa Whiskey Festival. It's in Ishikawa, Japan. Sotheby's has the Ultimate Whiskey Collection auction at the Olympia in London on October 24th. Nichols & Perks has a Balvenie Stories tasting with Alwyn Gwilt that night as well in Stourbridge, England. And Buffalo Trace Distillery hosts its annual Disturbia at the Distillery Halloween festivities on the 25th and 26th. Finally, I'll be back at Julio's Liquors in Westborough, Massachusetts on November 2nd for the American Single Malt Whiskey Seminar that afternoon and their Whiskey Roadshow that night. Right now, we have 154 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, a tasting, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to let us know about it. We'll add it to the list.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. We've talked a lot about Redbreast over the years, but this week marked a first for the brand. While the United States has traditionally been the largest market for Irish whiskey, we've only had the core Redbreast range available here. Over the last few years, Irish Distillers has started making single cask bottlings of Redbreast available to a handful of retailers and pubs, almost always in Ireland, and the last 2 years have seen Dream Cask releases each May for sale online to members of the Birdhouse, Redbreast's online affinity group, except for those who live in the U.S. Part of that is because U.S. laws don't allow for direct-to-consumer sales online, and another part is because those Dream Cask bottlings have been in 500-milliliter bottles, which are not legal in the U.S. This week, though, Irish Distillers unveiled the first Redbreast small batch bottlings for the U.S. market, specifically Massachusetts and California, with 4 separate cask-strength releases for specific retailers in Massachusetts and 8 different ones for stores in California. Each batch is destined for a specific retailer, but in some cases, 2 stores have agreed to work together to share their batches and split the allocations between them. The other night, Irish Distillers master blender Billy Leighton and his apprentice, David McCabe, unveiled the collection in Boston.
Really, what has pleased us about it is that there has been an uptake of all 4 batches. I think the worry for us whenever we put it together was that everybody would just prefer one particular batch, and it would mean that we possibly didn't do the job that we set out to do. But now we're pleased with the fact that there's been an uptake of all 4 batches, which means that we are sort of catering for the Redbreast consumer across the board.
And this is the first time you've released small batches outside of Ireland, right?
Correct. And the reason for releasing it in the States is that we have difficulties that or maybe for another day that we can't release the single cask Redbreast in the States. So this was kind of our contribution to the Redbreast fan that's based in America that doesn't have ready access to those single cask Redbreast that other markets are lucky to have.
Or the dream cask that the Birdhouse members get?
That's another subject that's, it's very close to my heart. My name goes on the label there, and it's I would like to see more people being able to experience the dream cask and enjoy it. It's something that we're working on, and hopefully, we have a program for the release of dream cask in the next few years. I mean, it's not only people in the US that haven't been able to get releases of the dream cask.
It's a lot of people that haven't been able to get the dream cask. I'm kind of humbled by the uptake of the dream cask and those people that are queuing up to buy a bottle of it, and it's kind of a testament to those people that came before me and laid down this whiskey and procured the casks in a generation before. If those people weren't there and didn't have their input, it's something that we couldn't do. Dave, tell me about the process of taking 4 different whiskeys, 2 pot still distillates, 2 different types of casks for 4 varieties, and blending them together to create 4 different complete whiskeys out of them. How'd you guys do it?
It was a challenge, to say the least, Mark, in the idea of our objective was to create 4 unique individual styles of Redbreast while using the same components to make all 4 and stay within the flavour profile that defines the Redbreast style of whiskey. So we kind of did our homework on the stock that we have and what we would typically use for the likes of maybe Redbreast 12. Everything we're using in these batches would be a minimum of 14 years of age. So we looked at the distillate types that we produce at Middleton, and we decided to use 2 different distillates which have aged in bourbon or sherry, or some of it has actually aged in bourbon and was moved to sherry just to add extra layers of complexity to what we were doing. So we said, okay, well, with 4 batches using the same components, let's try and emphasize the flavors of some of these whiskies more in some batches, kind of make them a bit more subtle in others while emphasizing other elements to it. So when we looked at batch A, we thought, okay, let's try and bring out the bourbon cask influence on the distillate here. So bring up that sweet kind of vanilla character, the charred wood, touches of kind of cinnamon type notes as well. And then batch B, we moved more to the sherry wine element, driving up the kind of the dried fruit character, but keeping kind of dark chocolate, coffee type characteristics. And with C, we wanted to create something that you would find in Redbreast, which is from a fruit element, but going from orchard fruits to something a bit more zesty and kind of citrus-esque. And then finally with batch D, we wanted to bring out the real heavy sherry element that you'd find in Redbreast, which is your real dried fruit, kind of raisins, prune, fig element, with a touch of a herbal note as well. So the challenge was to create all those individual styles using the same elements for all 4, but again emphasizing the different touch points in the 4. And the take up from the customers was great, that it was an even take up pretty much, that some preferred A to B or C to D, vice versa. So we were kind of worried, okay, well, hopefully one of them isn't the only one that they're all going to pick, and that shows true today with this evening, the tasting we did, that it seemed to have a mixed reactions of who likes what more. So it was a nice project, and we're pleased with the results.
And a lot of folks will see 2 different distillates and they're going to go, wait a second, because they're used to single malt where you basically have one kind of distillate coming off the still per distillery. But the way you guys do things at Middleton, you have the ability to sort of tweak the distillates and tweak the distillation methods to get different styles of whiskey, right?
That's exactly right. And I think when you look at the history of Irish distillers and how it came to be, it was the emergence of 3 individual distilleries, and I'm talking back in 1960s, 1966. So imagine the Jameson Distillery, the Powers Distillery, and the Cork Distilleries Company merging and making the decision to relocate to a brand new complex in Cork and still try and replicate the styles to a degree of how it was made in those pre-distilleries. So we didn't have the luxury of, like you might find other countries where you can buy and sell different whiskies from different distilleries. So, when you look at Barry Crockett and Bry Nation, they have and had the task of trying to create the different distillates in the same house to reflect those other brands. So, yeah, we are complex, I suppose you could say, in the distillery, that we tweak our distillations to try and make different distillate types, which for different brands are used either together, like in Redbreast, or we keep them separate for the likes of Powers. And then obviously the casks and the aging and the marrying of all those elements creates the huge variability in what we do. So it's it's an interesting place that it's not just one distillate put into different barrels to make the different brands. It's actually a medley of distillates produced in the one house.
Let's turn to another whiskey that just came out the other day, the 2019 edition of Middleton Very Rare, Billy. Tell me about this year's edition.
Middleton Very Rare just doesn't happen, It takes a long time in its inception, because Dave and myself would collaborate very much with Brian Nation. Brian, the Middleton Very Rare is Brian's baby, okay? So he, along with us, we would do the cask selection each year. Brian will have the final say. And this year we settled on a mix of grain and pot still casks, ranging in age, I think, from 13 up to about 34 years. So there's a huge age range in this year's offering. From a tasting note point of view, I mean, it's in the Middleton Very Rare style, and we don't like to deviate too much from year to year. But maybe pulling out this year a little bit more of kind of the spicy character that you get from the pot still component, but also the lighter notes that you get from the grain component that we have in there. And of course, everything that we use in Middleton Very Rare is American bourbon casks, so it is sweeter. So you don't have the fruitiness that comes along with sherry, for example. You have the fruitiness is a lighter orchard type fruit. You'll have apples, pears that you would get. You get a little bit of banana, for example. And I think at the end, the final product, whenever we put the prototypes together in the lab, and we had the tasting along with Brian, we didn't have much tweaking to do with it to end up with the finished product that we're all very happy with, and hopefully those Middleton Very Rare fans will enjoy the 2019 edition and add it to their collection.
And Brian gets the final say because, as you noted with the Dream cask from Redbreast, your signature goes on that one. Brian's goes on the Middleton Very Rare.
That's right, so I think when it comes to the point where you're actually putting your name on a label, you want to be able to stand up and be proud of that product, so we do take a lot of time, particularly with the Middleton Very Rare. I say it's not something that happens just in a short space of time. Really, whenever we produce, we have produced the 2019 now, and we're already starting to think about, okay, which casks are we going to select for the 2020 release. The Middleton Very Rare is something we always have kind of pretty much to the front of our minds all year round.
Kind of a cheeky question, Dave. When do you get your name on a bottle?
It's a cheeky question, Mark.
I'm kidding, of course.
Yeah, no, I'm very much I like to think in the early stages of my career, working with Billy from every day is really much a learning day. So, Billy's been in the business now 42 years, and, I'm amazed by what he knows and what I learn every time we're working on a project, even like with the small batches that we have this evening. So fingers crossed, once I keep learning from Billy about how he does it, watch this space, potentially hope, down the line. But
You've taught him almost everything he knows, but have you taught him everything you know yet, Billy?
Mark, that's a good question. I probably have forgotten as much as I have told Dave up until now. But even as Dave says, like every day is a school day. I mean, I'm sort of over 42 years in the business now, and still every day is a school day for me.
We haven't received any details about the California allocation for the Redbreast small batches yet, other than we do know that K&L Wines will have one batch. In Massachusetts, Julio's Liquors in Westboro and Redstone Liquors in Andover and Stoneham are splitting 2 batches between them, while Cappy's Liquors will have one batch for its stores, and the remaining one will be available at Norfolk Wines and Spirits in Foxborough. We will try to have more details on those California releases as they're available. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret, hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I had the chance to taste all 4 of the Massachusetts Redbreast small batch expressions the other night, and there are definitely differences between them, even though they all share the same basic elements. Batch D has an emphasis on whiskey that was matured in 2 different styles of ex-sherry casks, one where the whiskey spent its entire maturation in those Oloroso sherry casks, and one that started out in ex-bourbon barrels and was recasked into sherry after a few years. It's bottled at 58.9% ABV. The nose has a soft oakiness with honey, vanilla, muted baking spices, and just a hint of cocoa. The taste is thick with a lot of oak tannins and intense spicy notes of clove, cinnamon, and black pepper that are balanced by hints of honey, vanilla, and a subtle touch of garden herbs in the background. The finish is dry and slightly astringent with long-lasting spices, a hint of oakiness, honey, and vanilla. I'm giving Batch D a score of 94. By the way, it is one of the batches being split between Julio's Liquors and Redstone Liquors. And for the record, so is Batch A. But this one was blended to emphasize the impact of ex-bourbon barrels. It's bottled at 58.6% ABV. The nose has soft spices, honey, and touches of dried fruits and oak. The taste is spicy, oily, and thick with notes of dried citrus fruits, baking spices, honey, vanilla, and a hint of oak. The spices fade away gradually on the long finish with a subtle sweetness to keep it in balance. I'm scoring Batch A of the Redbreast small batch a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey, celebrating the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Let's stick with Irish whiskey for a moment. I had the chance to taste the 2019 release of Teeling Whiskey's single pot still this week. As we heard during the news, it follows the 3 test releases from Teeling in various markets over the last year and takes elements from each of them. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of honey, vanilla, butterscotch, muted spices, and dried flowers. The taste has classic pot still spiciness with clove, cinnamon, and allspice notes, complemented by honey, vanilla, and butterscotch in the background. The finish is long and smooth with honey, vanilla, and slowly fading spices. I'm scoring the Teeling single pot still whiskey a 91. And don't forget to listen to next week's WhiskyCast for more of my interview with Teeling Master Distiller Alex Chasko. I received a sample of Heaven Hill's new 7-year-old bottled in bond bourbon the other day, complete with a retro-style label that's reminiscent of the post-Prohibition era. As we've reported before, this one replaces the original 6-year-old Heaven Hill bottled in bond that was discontinued a couple of years ago, and it will have a lot wider availability than the original. Of course, it is still bottled at 50% ABV. The nose is aromatic with a good oakiness, brown sugar, dark chocolate, black cherries, and hints of caramel apples and vanilla. The taste has a great balance of spices and sweeter notes with peppercorns, cinnamon, and a hint of clove that are balanced nicely by brown sugar, vanilla, caramel, and dark chocolate. The spices build to a nice crescendo on the finish, then fade away slowly with the sweeter notes underneath. I love the original, but this one is even better. I'm scoring the Heaven Hill 7-year-old bottled in bond bourbon a 94. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,700 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out today at whiskycast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. Had a great question on Twitter from Jack Toy at Jackabus the other day. Hey there, WhiskyCast. Apologies if this has already been asked. Do you think we're through that recent rut of aged whiskey stock, whereby a lot of NAS expressions were introduced to compensate for a lack of 10 years old and plus whiskey? I'm seeing more Talisker 10, Lafroig 10 age statement whiskeys being released again, which seems like a sign of a healthier inventory for these distilleries. Have you heard anything anecdotal on your whiskey travels, good sir? Well, Jack, thanks for the question. Keep in mind that inventory specifics are usually considered very confidential and not something that distilleries are usually willing to share. However, if you look back to a decade ago or so, the period between 2006 and 2008 was when we started to see the beginnings of the current boom in whiskey sales, and that is about the time that distilleries in Scotland and other companies started to increase production. A lot of that whiskey is now 10 years old or more, making it possible to bottle more of the 10-year-old whiskeys we used to see all the time. The one exception was in Japan, where distilleries lagged behind the rest of their colleagues around the world and did not step up production as quickly. That's why we'll still be seeing shortages of older Japanese whiskey for a few more years. Michael Mann tweeted this question: has there been any update from Chip Tate about Tate & Company Distilling? I checked in with the whiskey wizard of Waco and got this response. Hey Mark, we're still working away on the place, but the Tate & Company project has grown to over 27 acres, so much to do besides just building stills. I'm hoping to have something more concrete on an open date that I could give you soon, but many dominoes to line up. In summary, could I answer, not quite yet, but very soon. Chip confirmed he has some stuff from one-off projects aging at other places, but has nothing yet distilled at his place in Waco. We will get an update from him when that changes. I want to thank everyone again who joined us for our special Redbreast tasting the other night at Julio's Liquors in Massachusetts. We tasted both of the Redbreast small batch bottlings Julio's will have, along with the special bottle I hinted at last time around. It was the Redbreast Dream Cask 20-year-old Pedro Jimenez edition released this past May for members of the Birdhouse only, and was not available in the U.S. But our friends at Redbreast arranged to get a bottle to me and asked that we pour it at a public tasting to give some of their U.S. fans a chance to taste it. So that's just what we did. A lot of the people who were there posted their thanks and comments on social media. You can check our timelines for some of those comments. A couple of things to mention. If you're a member of a whiskey club, listen up. One of the features of our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast in the last couple of years has been the Whiskey Club of the Month, where we pick a different whiskey club around the world to honor and send them 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at their club tastings. We are moving the Whiskey Club of the Month to WhiskyCast. On the first episode of each month, we'll pick a club to honor, but we need to hear from you starting now. If you have a club that meets on a regular basis, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Tell us a little about your club, and if you have a website or a place where potential members can find you on social media, we'll be glad to add you to our Whiskey Clubs page at whiskycast.com. You might just win 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at your club's tastings. And we want to thank the folks at Glencairn Crystal for supporting the Whiskey Club of the Month. Now for the second note. As you're probably aware, I hit the road a lot to take WhiskyCast out of the studio for whiskey festivals around the world. Next month, I'll be at the New Brunswick Spirits Festival in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Of course, I'll be at the Victoria Whiskey Festival again this January in British Columbia. And we can confirm now that in March of 2020, I'll be heading south to Christchurch, New Zealand for Whiskey Galore's Dramfest on March 7th and 8th. Michael Fraser Milne of Whiskey Galore and I have been trying to make this happen for several years now, since they only hold Dramfest every other year. And I am really glad we were able to finally get it worked out for 2020. There's a link for details on our calendar of events page at whiskycast.com. And if you're anywhere in New Zealand or Australia, or plan to make the trip from elsewhere, I hope to see you there. Until then, if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. You can also email us directly. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. This time around, let's look at some of the ways distilleries in Scotland are trying to work in a more environmentally friendly way. Old Pulteney has kicked off a campaign called Rise with the Tide to highlight ocean health. The campaign is working with groups that are finding new ways to promote sustainable products that reduce carbon footprints and ocean pollution. For instance, Sustainable Surf in California has the EcoBoard project. It works with surfboard makers to build boards from renewable and recycled materials while reducing the usage of toxic materials in the manufacturing process. Pulteney Distillery is located in the old fishing town of Wick along the coast of the North Sea. So, distillery manager Malcolm Waring sees a natural link.
It greatly affects our whiskey. It's where we come from. It's our DNA. It's such an important part, an integral part of the process, and we're trying to roll out the message that we've worked in conjunction with great people. We've had Doug Allen there, who's worked on the Blue Planet. He's very much environmentalist. You've got the guys there from the California that making the eco boards and really understand and get how much the ocean is important to us all, really, and the sustainability. And it's going through adversity, and it's overcoming problems through sustainability and that, really.
Pulteney was also one of the first distilleries in Scotland to practically eliminate the use of fossil fuels in its production. Its boilers are fueled with wood chips from sustainably managed forests nearby.
We've never been using fossil fuel now for probably the best part of it's over 12 years. We use biomass wood chip Steam comes down to me. I use the distillery. I drive the distillery with the steam used from wood chip. The condensate, the hot water from the steam comes off that. It goes round and it heats 250 homes in the town of Wick and Pulteney. It also heats the hospital, the library, and 2 sheltered housing accommodation for old people. And the hot water is returned back and it's recycled around that way. So people who are on the actual grid there, they pay a very small token amount of money for it. And it's all about alleviating fuel poverty within a small community.
A couple of hours down the coast, Glenmorangie Distillery sits on the shore of the Dornoch Firth. We've talked before about Glenmorangie's project to restore the oyster reefs in the Firth. A century ago, those reefs were one of Europe's prized fishing grounds, but overfishing largely wiped out the oyster population back then. Now, the distillery used to pump its pot ale and other liquid waste into the Firth, but recently replaced that with an anaerobic digestion system that takes all of the spent grains, pot ale, and other crud. The process generates methane gas that fuels the distillery's boilers, and the remaining sludge is used as fertilizer by area farmers. That leaves behind a small amount of treated liquid that can safely be disposed of without damaging the environment. That process is not a new one, though. Way back in 2007, we first reported on a similar system at Maker's Mark in Kentucky that was one of the first in the industry. By the way, you can read more about the Glenmorangie project in the Los Angeles Review of Books, where Louise Schiavone wrote about it last month. We'll post a link in the show notes at whiskeycast.com. And if you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. We'll be starting our 15th year of WhiskyCast soon, and we're working on a few ideas to celebrate the anniversary of whiskey's longest-running podcast. If you have an idea, let us know about it. You can always use the contact form at whiskeycast.com, get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or just email us. The address is comments@whiskeycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.